Talking Trees with Lily and Jad. Welcome to our Thursday episode of Talking Trees, where every week we dedicate time to consulting arboriculture. This week we're tackling a critical topic in the field, tree risk assessment, with a special focus on methods and approaches which we can use. We'll explore how trees respond to mechanical stress, adapt to environmental challenges, and what signs to look for when assessing the structural integrity of a tree. Let's get started.
Welcome to a deep dive. For everyone out there working with trees in public spaces, parks, streets, campuses, anywhere, people and trees kind of got to figure out how to get along. And today, we're going to tackle this whole thing about keeping trees around, but also making sure they're not going to fall on anybody.
Yeah, it's a tough balance to strike, right? I mean, we're not talking about statues here. Trees are living things in a constantly changing world.
Exactly. And to help us unpack all of this, you've brought us research articles, strategy documents, even a guide for a tree risk assessment app. It's a lot.
Well, it's a complex topic. I think the variety of materials really shows just how much goes into making sure trees are a benefit to public spaces and not a danger.
So when you're looking at all of this as someone who works in this field, what's the first thing that grabs your attention?
It always comes back to that central challenge of finding a balance. We absolutely have to minimize the risk of trees failing. But we also don't want to lose sight of all the incredible things trees bring to the table.
Yet a world without trees would be.
Yeah.
Let's not even go there.
Yeah.
So it's not about eliminating risk completely. In fact, one source called it a common sense approach to tree risk management. Is that how you describe it?
100%. It's just like anything else in life. You can't eliminate every single risk. It's not like we can wrap every tree in bubble wrap. We're dealing with living things here. They grow, they age, they weather storms, they get diseases. They're part of a whole ecosystem. It's really about managing the risk we can control, not pretending we can get rid of it entirely.
So instead of asking, is this tree safe? We should really be asking what?
We should be asking, okay, what's the level of risk here and what can we do about it?
That's really what tree risk assessment boils down to. It's about looking at the likelihood of a tree failing, what could happen if it did fail, and even things like how many people are actually in the area. Because risk isn't just about the tree itself, right? It's about what's around it and what could be impacted. That makes sense. And I'm seeing some of these sources talk about different systems for actually measuring this risk. We've got TRAQ, QTRA, VALID. Can you give us a quick overview of what each of these brings to the table?
Sure. Let's start with TRAQ. That stands for Tree Risk Assessment Qualification, and it's from the International Society of Arboriculture. Now, TRAQ itself isn't really a calculation. It's more about making sure the person assessing the risk actually knows what they're doing. So someone with TRAQ certification has gone through the ISA's training on best practices, which is really important as a foundation.
So it's making sure the assessor is competent. Seems like a good place to start.
Absolutely. Then you've got QTRA, which is Quantified Tree Risk Assessment. This one's all about putting numbers to the risk. So using probabilities and statistics to figure out the actual likelihood of a tree causing harm.
I can see how that would be useful, especially if you have to explain decisions about a tree to people.
Absolutely. One source I was reading actually mentioned how the chance of someone getting killed by a falling tree is way lower than the chance of dying in a car crash. And QTRA is really helpful for putting those risks into a more relatable context.
That's a great way to put it into perspective. Okay, so we've got TROQ for the assessor's expertise. We've got QTRA for quantifying the risk. Where does VALID come in?
VALID is really big on being practical. It focuses on things that pretty much anyone, even without tons of training, can pick up on, like obvious signs a tree might be in trouble. So think like huge cracks in the soil around the base of the tree, branches that are hanging down at weird angles if the whole tree is suddenly leaning more than it used to. These are all red flags that even someone who doesn't work with trees can often spot.
So it's a way to prioritize. Like if you see those obvious signs, then you know it's time to dig a little deeper.
Exactly. And VALID has this really smart tiered approach. There's the basic level, which is often enough. But if needed, it can be bumped up to a detailed assessment or even an advanced assessment, depending on what the situation calls for.
It sounds like each method has its own strengths. So how does someone working in the field decide which one is best for a given situation? Because I'm imagining a quiet corner of a park versus a street lined with trees near a school might lead to very different approaches.
You're absolutely right. Context is key. The level of detail you need, the resources you have available, time, budget, how much expertise you've got on hand, it all factors in. And yeah, a quiet little corner of the park versus a busy street lined with trees next to a school, those need totally different approaches to risk assessment.
So even with these established systems, there's still room for flexibility. It's not just, okay, here's the formula applied to every tree,
Right.
which I imagine is a relief for the people out there dealing with 1,000 different tree situations every single day.
It has to be. Remember, we're talking about living organisms here. And just like no two trees are ever exactly alike, no two risk assessments are going to be identical either.
Speaking of things that aren't always identical, something that really struck me in these sources was how much emphasis they put on public perception. Even if, statistically, a tree is low risk, if the public is concerned about it, that matters. Why is that such an important part of the equation?
Because when it comes down to it, managing public spaces also means managing how people experience those spaces.
Right.
Fear, even if it doesn't perfectly line up with the actual risk, is still a factor. I've seen cases where a tree was statistically pretty low risk, but there was so much public concern, so much worry, that it ended up being removed anyway. So you've got this balance to find between what we understand scientifically and how people are actually feeling and reacting.
So how do you bridge that gap? Because it doesn't sound like it's as easy as just saying, well, the numbers check out so you don't have to worry.
No, it definitely isn't. This is where being a good arborist means more than just knowing your trees. It means being a communicator. It's about explaining your assessment in a way that makes sense to people who aren't tree experts so they can understand it and trust your judgment. And sometimes it's about getting creative, finding solutions that address the actual risk, but also take into account how people perceive that risk.
So it's not just about the science, it's also about that human element. This is fascinating. And honestly, all this talk about assessment makes me want to know more about how you actually do it. Like, what are some of the things you look for when you're evaluating a tree in the field?
It starts broad. It's kind of like, when you go to the doctor, they ask about your overall health and lifestyle. Same with trees. We look at the tree's environment. What are the growing conditions like? Soil type, how much water is available, how much wind does this tree have to deal with? Even the history of the site can be important. All of those things contribute to a tree's health and how stable it is.
So you're basically doing environmental detective work before you even look at the tree itself.
Exactly. You need that context. Then you can move on to the tree itself. How old is it? How fast does it grow? Are there any weaknesses that are common to this species, especially as it gets older? We look at the whole structure of the tree, the branches, the canopy, the trunk. All of those visual clues tell a story.
And some of those stories are easier to read than others, I imagine. Are there any, telltale signs that immediately make your antenna go up as an arborist?
Oh, definitely. If you see big cracks in the bark or in the trunk itself, mushrooms growing around the base of the tree can be a bad sign. Dead branches are obviously something to pay attention to. If the tree is leaning significantly, or if you notice wounds or cavities that are exposing the wood inside, those are all red flags. And depending on how severe they are, they might mean it's time to do a more in-depth assessment.
Okay, so you spotted something that needs a closer look. What happens then? What does a more advanced assessment look like?
Well, that's when we bring in the more sophisticated tools. Things like sonic tomography.
Sonic tomography.
Yeah, it's kind of like giving the tree an ultrasound, actually.
Oh, interesting.
So we use sound waves to create a map of what's going on inside the tree. That way we can see things like decay or cavities that we wouldn't be able to spot just by looking from the outside.
That's amazing. You can see inside the tree without having to cut it down.
It really has changed how we assess risk, and it just goes to show how much tree care is always evolving. We're constantly learning new things about trees, developing new technologies that help us understand them even better.
Which brings us back to those systems we were talking about before. TOAQ, QTRA, valid. Do you think any of these is going to become like the gold standard for tree risk assessment in the future? Or is it always going to be about choosing the right approach for the situation?
I think it's always going to be about finding the right tool for the job, honestly, because every tree is different, every situation has its own quirks, and these methods, they all have their own strengths and weaknesses. So the important thing is to understand those nuances, and then you can choose the approach that makes the most sense for that particular tree in that specific environment.
So it's not about trying to force every tree into the same box. It's about learning how to listen to what each individual tree is telling you, and then using that knowledge to make the best decisions.
Exactly. That's what I love about this field. It's this blend of science and art and a deep respect for the natural world.
This has been an amazing deep dive. So for our listeners out there, the people who are dealing with these exact challenges every day, what's the one thing you want them to take away from this conversation?
I'd say, remember this. Every tree has its own story, and it's written in its rings, in its branches, even in the way it stands. The better we get at reading those stories, the better we'll be at keeping our trees healthy and making sure that everyone stays safe.
Well said. And for anyone who wants to explore this topic even further, be sure to check out our show notes. We'll have links to all the resources we talked about today. Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.
That wraps up our Thursday episode of Talking Trees, where we focused on tree risk assessment and the methods used to evaluate a tree's structural integrity. Thank you for tuning in to our arboriculture consulting series. Be sure to join us tomorrow for more expert insights and practical advice. Until then, take care of your trees and keep exploring the wonders of arboriculture.